welcome everyone. Today I am speaking with Raj from Young Mountain Tea and Kumaon Tea, and he's doing some really exciting things in this region of India for tea. So I'm really happy to share, what he's doing there with all of you. So thank you so much for being with me today, Raj.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Nicole. And hello to everybody in your audience. It's fun to join your channel.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Young Mountain Tea and what you're doing with Kumaon Tea?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I started Young Mountain Tea in 2013. We were just discussing before about how we've now been doing this for a little while. We finally crossed double digits. So, yeah, coming on our 11th year. And I started the company really with the promise to farmers in Kumaon, in this region in northern India, that if they would grow tea, I would start a company in the US to sell it. And so from the very beginning, the goal has always been to figure out how can we make tea serve as a catalyst for sustainable livelihoods for mountainous villagers. And that's because these villages are, like many rural parts of the world, just slowly getting hollowed out by urban migration as the youth leave in search of work. I'm of Indian descent, but was born and brought up in the U.S. I kind of fell in love with the mountains, the Himalayas in North India, in my early 20s, and it was kind of just striking to see that all the people that were my age were doing everything they could to leave this area just as I was getting so excited to come in. So Young Mountain fundamentally exists to figure out how do we make livelihoods for people who want to stay in the mountains lucrative and attractive. And there's both a financial component, but also an aspirational component that factors into that. But anyway, that's what we do. Our mission is to work with farmers to help them raise the quality of their tea so that they can earn more and then raise the quality of their lives. And for us, when people who get to drink the tea, that results in a much wider variety of tea than traditionally has come out of India. So rather than just black tea, also working with whites, greens, oolongs, and more.
Awesome. I definitely remember, when I first encountered your company, I think it was at World Tea Expo. I
Mm-hmm.
tried the white tea, and it was really the first white tea I had tried from India. And I was just
Oh,
like,
fun.
first of all, it was delicious, but it was just really fascinating to see teas. Like, obviously, India is typically associated with black tea, but it was really exciting to see different types of tea coming out of India.
Yeah, thanks. And I share that white tea in particular is very much symbolic of what our work is all about. Um, when I got involved with working with farms in Kumaon, they hadn't heard of white tea before. Um, but what had happened was that I had done a Kickstarter in the U.S. to raise funds to go get the first harvest of tea, and I promised the backers to the Kickstarter that it was going to be a white tea. I went to that group that we made the promise to get things going, and this farmer group there that unfortunately their plot had totally failed, so there was no tea to be had. And so it was a moment of desperation. I kind of networked through the region and learned about this other village about 4 hours away that was growing tea. So I brought them the sample of Baimudan from Jasmine Pearl, actually in Portland. They had shared some of their white, and I brought it to them and showed it to the farmer. The head tea farmer, his name is Desmond, and he's our closest partner today. So he crushed the tea in his hands and he smelled it and he said, "If this is what you want, I can make it happen." And so that white tea that you had is actually sort of his spirit of creativity, uh, infused by our helping bring inspirational teas that can help to trigger new ways of thinking about what's possible. And the other thing I'll say about that tea and Kumaon as a whole is that the tea bushes are about 170 years old right now. So they're some of the absolute oldest tea bushes in India that predate Darjeeling and different areas in Assam. And so it's an exciting thing to have this living history, but also combining it with a more modern way of thinking about what tea is.
That's really cool. People might be familiar with some of the more well-known, growing regions in India, like Darjeeling and Assam. Where is Kumaon?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So it's in northern India, and Nepal sits. Uh, this is so I'm from Michigan originally, which just means I use my hand in showing all geographic references. But if you picture India as sort of a upside down diamond, the northeast border is the Himalaya, and so Kumaon's on Nepal's northwestern corner, which is exactly opposite of the border where Darjeeling is. It's not a great description, but to say that Darjeeling is a little southeast of where this region is, and Kumaon, yeah, a little northwest. It's a region that historically didn't grow tea. The British brought tea there And when they planted tea in India, and I learned this from that book, For All the Tea in China. Have you read that?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Sarah Rose describes how some of the first ever Indian grown tea to be drunk in Europe came from right around this area. It's not Kumaon exactly because of modern day boundaries, but it's right there. And so this is a region that has historically had the potential to grow tea, but it was so far away from the ports that the British couldn't set up supply trade lines to get the tea out of the mountains into the port, and so they abandoned it. And for about 80 years, the tea bush just kind of grew in the wild. There's only one family that was involved with preserving it, and they're the Birkbecks. And today, the second generation of that family, Desmond, is our closest on the ground partner, who's helped setting up this factory that we're processing tea in together. But that was a long description to say it's in North India, and it's a region that has historically been very ignored because of its remoteness. So it's not just the tea industry that has sort of said like it's too hard to set up supply lines. It's all forms of industry, which contributes to the issue that we have today of all this rural migration.
And with Kumaon Tea, you're establishing a farmer-owned tea factory. How is that different than, say, the traditional business model for tea?
Yeah, thanks for that question as well. So, yeah, the British brought tea to India. There wasn't really much intentional cultivation. There's some stuff in Assam that had been tribally grown, but nothing on a large scale. And so, when the British brought tea to India, the model that they set up was created as the estate model, in which the British took the lands from the local farmers and then forced them to replant what had been food crops for local consumption with tea for export. And so from the beginning, both the land that the tea grew on, as well as the processing facility that converted the harvest to the finished teas that we drink, none of that was held by the local community. And so traditionally, in that time, these farmers were dependent on the owners of the estate for their housing, for their education for their kids, for healthcare services, for food subsidies. So it was a very strong dependency of the farmers on the estate owners. And ecologically, the downside of this approach is that it's monoculturing an entire mountainside essentially with a single tea bush. So it sort of made sense at the time. You could argue, history is of the past. However, unfortunately, largely informs the model that exists today, where the farmers continue to have almost no position in the value chain of tea. On the more dominant estate model that is prevalent in Assam and Darjeeling, tea farmers typically don't own the land, and they almost never own the factories. And the tea is going to be made in huge quantities of fairly mass market styles of black. So the Kumaon Tea is trying to create an alternative to that estate model by promoting what is the smallholder farmer model of tea, which isn't unique certainly to Indian tea, but unfortunately it's very rare. There's a little bit of activity in Nepal, and we've learned from our friends there who are kind of coaches and advisors to us. And we've learned also from other people in other industries, like in coffee or wine, where the smallholder farmers have a stake. But what we're trying to do is set up a model where the farmers, first of all, own the land, but then, even more important, own the factory where the tea is processed. And that's because as we learned more about the economics of the tea value chain, we learned that traditionally the estates lose money growing the tea bushes in the garden because it's so labor intensive, and then make up for that by making a bunch of money out of the factories. The factory is the more lucrative part of the production process between cultivation and processing. However, farmers typically don't have the resources to afford being able to set up um, a facility that it's a full building equipped with technical instruments that require expertise to run. And so this project, this factory that we're setting up now, the whole point is to demonstrate what happens when you fundamentally shift the value, the ownership structure, so that more value is held by the farmers. Of course, they already own their own land, and there's the example of the Nilgiris in South India, where that's more common, another tea growing region. But as far as we can tell, there have been no examples where the farmers own a specialty tea factory. And by specialty, we mean with the ability to make whole leaf, small batch styles that traditionally haven't been in India. And the only reason we're able to make that claim is because we've been working with a range of technical consultants to help equip this with the world's absolute most cutting edge processing technology. So fundamentally, all of this, what we're trying to do is go shift from a model where the farmers don't own anything to one where they own both the land and the factories. And I'm happy to chat more if you want to go into any details of. the joys and challenges of that approach.
Yeah, I can imagine that it is challenging because you're really doing something that has not been done before. I would definitely love to hear more about, what challenges you've encountered there.
Yeah, sure. And I'll say it's been helpful to have a lot of mentors in this process. I felt like, if it was just me and our team figuring this out as we go, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. But thankfully, I feel like the generosity of the tea community is one where people want to support the next generation to come up. And so we see our sort of work as part of that. And we've also had help from other people like Nish at Nepal Tea and Paul at Just Tea, other people who are involved working with smallholder farmers and coaches. But none of that could help with the most formidable challenges have been setting up the legal structures. So to have the factory, one thing that we're doing that's a little bit different than the traditional approach to getting involved in this kind of international development work is that we intentionally have an ownership stake in the factory. Young Mountain, we set up a subsidiary, and that subsidiary has an ownership stake in the company that owns the factory alongside the farmers. So this isn't 100% farmer owned initially, it's shared ownership. And I can describe why we decided that was an important route to take if you'd like to in a second. But I'll say that the challenges of setting up a legal system that connects entities in the US to a mix of both formal existing private enterprises as well as charitable trusts that we created on behalf of the farmers has been an absolute nightmare of a process. It took us about 2 years to work through all the legal documents, and lawyers on both sides of India and the U.S., both with us as well as with our funders, because we have diversified funding where we have support from USAID, the International Development arm of the U.S. government, but then also private investment from an impact investor. And so, sort of lining all this kind of like complex web of entities that are connected and meets everybody's needs, which needs in the U.S. are different than needs in India, has been really a process where it's been also interesting to recognize that even we were lucky to secure support from some very respected international legal as well as accounting teams. And a lot of them were scratching their heads too and saying, like, yeah, you know what? There's no real black and white answer to a lot of these questions about how taxes will be impacted by these kinds of things. So it's certainly not a world that I or any of the other partners on the project had any familiarity with, but very much as I think is representative of all of the entrepreneurial journey. It's kind of learning as you go, and then keep going and keep going and keep going and trust that something will emerge. And I'm glad to say that it took us 2 years, but we set up everything, and now it's now we just got to figure out how to take the next steps. But the setup is done. Oh, it's not the most exciting stuff. That's not glamorous like lots of legal documents. However, what we found is like get the nuts and bolts of making this actually work in the long run. So we really have to get it right, and I'm glad to say we have the support to make that happen.
That's great. What kind of teas are you planning to make in the Kumaon Tea factory?
Yeah, we've so our technical consultant is named Nigel Melican. Have you crossed paths with Nigel?
Yes, yes, I definitely know Nigel.
Okay, cool. Yeah, he's like in my mind the Gandalf of tea. He's got
He
more
is.
experience growing tea in different environments than pretty much anyone in the world at this point. He spent 4 decades growing tea on 6 continents, and so we were really lucky to have him being our guide in how to set this processing facility up for success. And so, working with him, we developed what we're referring to as two production lines that are in parallel. And so, one we're calling orthodox, which is probably what many people would be familiar with orthodox production of tea, where you make usually black tea, and there's a bunch of grades that are made at the same time and try to sort them out. And so that's kind of the Indian traditional way of making tea versus the other style, CTC, which maybe in another conversation we talked about, but we're not touching any CTC. So we're doing orthodox on one side, but then we're importing all this equipment from China that is really designed for small scale, high quality production. And so that's what we're calling the specialty line. So we'll have two in parallel. The orthodox, which Desmond already has a ton of familiarity with how to make, and will be primarily black teas. But then also the specialty line where we're going to be experimenting and trying new styles. So we're for sure in the first season, which begins in just a couple weeks here, going to make a good amount of black and white tea in the orthodox, well, black tea on the orthodox and then white on the specialty side, because of those two styles of tea that Desmond has been making for about 10 years now. But we also have this opportunity to begin experimenting with greens, oolongs, and pu'ers. I don't think we're going to touch pu'ers right now, but we did buy the processing equipment to do a little bit of everything. And actually, just last week, I was talking to a good friend, Alicia Gentili, who's going to help us out by spending the month of June going and spending time with Desmond. Alicia is a tea processing consultant, so she's going to work with him to figure out what do the greens and oolongs look like. And so, really, exactly what kinds of teas they produce is what I'm looking forward to finding out in early July. Um, but we'll be able to make the full range, starting with blacks and whites, but then likely greens and oolongs that are more representative of like the Taiwanese style of oolongs. I'm sure I feel like tried a lot of semi-oxidized blacks that people are presenting as oolongs, but they're not using the fourth or fifth leaves. They're not doing the sort of cycling between oxidizing and rolling. So we want to play around with that to see what kind of flavors we can get out.
That's super exciting. I'm sure we'll just have to see what works well.
Yeah. What do you have any suggestions? Anything jump to mind that you think would be interesting for us to give a try?
Yeah, I think definitely oolong is, I think, the category that, like you said, like if any Indian oolongs I've seen, they were really just partially oxidized teas. They didn't necessarily
Right.
undergo the full processing steps that would, by definition, make it an oolong. So it'll be
Yes.
really exciting, since you have the equipment to be able to do that.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that's the one I'm the most excited. And I don't know. I was talking to Lisa last week. Like, do we go for like the more light floral or like the more heavy roasted? And she said, Raj, you can't say that till we're there and we've got our hands in the leaf. So I was like, all right, you're the pro. Uh, yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. I can't wait for this fall when we have all the teas in stock to share.
Definitely. That's super exciting. I really love that you're making it a farmer owned factory and, working to really benefit the people that are making the tea. Can you tell me a little bit more about like what issues that, people in that region that are making tea, what they typically are kind of dealing with?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Because these farmers are recently graduated out of a government program where the government controlled everything, including how often they were paid, as well as how much they were paid. And that was based not on how much tea they grew or harvested, but just on their ability to show up on time daily, which is important for a farmer to have that stability. So a good program in theory. But the biggest challenge that we're now running into is that the farmers don't associate how much tea that they grow with how much they should earn. There's a disconnect as they're transitioning from being essentially employees of the government to becoming independent smallholder farmers. And that really becomes a lot like having to run your own tiny business as a farmer. And that skill set is presently not really in the village. So the way we're addressing that is that we've partnered with a local co-op. The same co-op that when I was working there in 2013 and promised that if they grow tea, I'd buy and start a company. It's the same co-op farmers. They're now providing trainings to these farmers on what they call capacity building. So understanding how to do things like record keeping, how to do things like collective savings, how to do things like navigate gender dynamics when discussing governance internally, both the village as well as to their organization. And so that work is really the heart of the work for me. It's also the most complicated in that there's a lot of cultural norms that we have to be mindful of. And there's also a lot of difference in cultural values. For example, these are largely communities where men are the exclusive decision makers, and even though 90% of the farmers are women. Um, and so, me as a Westerner with my views around what I think gender equity should look and feel like, there's been conversations that had to have the hard way of understanding both sides of where we're at in order to figure out solutions for the future. But a lot of my mentors remind us that this isn't work that happens overnight. These kinds of shifts that they're actually going to take root and become long term, it's going to take years, if not decades. And just like the tea plant, you have to be patient. So, um, yeah, again, I'd say it's the most rewarding part of our work is to work with the farmers, meeting them where they're at and helping them sort of build the internal capacity to take ownership and take kind of empowerment of their future. It's been wonderfully rewarding and also really challenging, and also something that it's going to take decades to get just right. But we look forward to the journey.
Very cool. Where can people find Kumau tea?
Right now, the best way is through our website, which is youngmountaintea.com. We've got a drop down section on Kumau. And actually, we've just built a top level nav bar option to learn more about this whole project, Kumaon Tea, a little bit more about the history and sort of the people involved with the present, and then what we're thinking about for the future. And then, yeah, we're focused primarily on the West Coast, so grocery stores on the West are the best way to go. But what I guess my request would be is that if people want to have Kumaon teas, they talk to their local tea companies or to their grocery stores about carrying us or carrying Kumaon teas. And one of the things that we've done is make sure that the name Kumao is involved in all of the tea names. And so far, all of our partners who resell these teas have been really wonderful about making sure to include that through all the way to the tea drinkers, so they know that these teas come from Kumau. Because right now we're the exclusive American importer of Kumau teas. So if you see the name Kumau, it's coming from this one set of farmers. And so yeah, that'd be the request, is to help us spread the word so that these farmers have more stability through gaining access to your tea cups and sharing their leaves.
I definitely highly recommend giving these teas a try. I've really enjoyed them every time I've had them.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking time to share what you're doing with Kamau Tea. And I really hope that I'll include the link in the description so that everyone can go check it out.
Thanks so much. And yeah, we hope you also visit. Oh, sorry, one last thing. We're also organizing a guided trip to this region in October, and Nigel is going to be providing instruction on that trip. So we're going to study everything about tea, from the seed in the nursery to the bush in the garden to processing the own tea that we harvest ourselves in this factory using cutting edge technologies in October. So you're always invited to come check this area out. But if you really want a deeper experience, this is middle of October. And yeah, we've got information on our website about the guided trips there as well. But the invitation is open
That
always.
sounds super exciting.
Yeah, thank you.
Dream tea trip.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, thank you.
Well, I'll also, yeah. But yeah, thank you again so much. And I hope that this helps a lot of people discover your tea.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Yeah, thank you. Bye, everybody.